Jersey Lilly. Stick around. Today we're hanging out with history, home-cooked beans, and the spirit of an entire town.
The Jersey Lilly Saloon fed 40 men chili at 11 at night in July, in a town where the nearest ice sat 6 days away by wagon. Judge Roy Bean poured the whiskey himself, and every plate leaving his kitchen had to survive a Texas summer with 0 ice touching it. He wasn't running a bar. He was running a supply chain with a piano in it, and if it failed, armed men went hungry. That's why saloon cooks solved a logistics problem modern restaurants still throw refrigerated trucks at, using only salt, smoke, and timing. Picture the math first, because it's the part that makes the rest make sense. A Cattletown saloon on a Saturday night could push 300-400 meals across one counter. No walk-in cooler, no delivery truck, often no ice house within 100 miles. And yet the same kitchen that fed 40 men chili at midnight had fed 40 different men breakfast 12 hours earlier, off the same limited stock, without anyone dying of it. The trick wasn't better food, it was better arithmetic. Start with what a saloon actually served, because cowboy food gets mythologized into steak and beans, and that's not quite it. The real menu ran on things that didn't need cold to stay safe. Salt pork, hardtack, beans, dried, then reconstituted in a pot that never fully emptied, just kept getting topped off. Coffee boiled so strong, a spoon reportedly stood up in it, partly for the caffeine and partly because boiling water is itself a food safety tool, whether the cook thought of it that way or not. The famous saloon chili, the dish Bean's Jersey Lilly was known for, worked because chili peppers are a preservative in their own right. Capsaicin slows bacterial growth. A pot of chili simmering all day at a rolling boil, topped up as it emptied, is a self-sterilizing stew. And cooks in the 1880s didn't need a microbiology degree to know it kept longer than plain stewed beef. That's rung 1 on the ladder, picking foods that fight spoilage by their own chemistry. But the real rung 1, the one underneath even the chili, was simpler than any recipe. Don't store the meat at all. Keep it alive until the moment it's needed. A Cattletown saloon rarely stocked a week's worth of beef in a cellar because a live steer doesn't spoil. Saloons and the chuck wagons that fed the drives themselves bought or held cattle, hogs and chickens on the hoof, and a cook killed only what the day's crowd would eat, sometimes that same afternoon. The animal was the refrigerator. It walked itself to the kitchen, stayed fresh right up until the knife, and left nothing behind for bacteria to work on overnight. Chickens got the same treatment on a smaller scale, kept in a coop out back until an order came in. It sounds obvious once it's said out loud, and that's exactly why it gets skipped over. Frontier cooks weren't fighting spoilage with clever tricks nearly as often as they were simply refusing to let the clock start. Rung 2 is where it gets more interesting, because salt wasn't just seasoning, it was the actual refrigeration system. Salt pork and salt beef worked by osmosis, pulling water out of meat fast enough that the bacteria, which need that water, simply can't establish a foothold. A barrel of pork packed in dry salt or submerged in brine strong enough to float an egg could sit through a Texas July that would turn fresh meat rancid in an afternoon. Saloons bought meat this way by the barrel because a barrel doesn't need tending. It doesn't need a fire kept lit or a spring-fed springhouse nearby. It needs a dry corner and time. Cowboys hated the taste by most accounts, which is exactly why saloons drowned it in chili, gravy, and enough black pepper to disguise a shoe leather. That disguise job is likely the real origin of half the spicy cowboy dishes people now assume were about flavor first. Then there's smoke, rung 3, and smoke did 2 jobs at once. It dried meat further And the smoke itself deposits compounds that are mildly antimicrobial, which is why smoked bacon and jerked beef could travel for weeks in a saddlebag without a cooler in sight. A saloon that ran a smokehouse out back, even a crude one, essentially built its own shelf-stable pantry. Jerky, in particular, solved a specific saloon problem. A cowboy paying for a meal wanted something substantial fast, and dried, salted, smoked beef, torn into a stew or gnawed straight, delivered protein without a single ounce of it needing cold. Here's the part that surprises people, though, and it's the one worth sitting with. Saloons did use ice, just not the way anyone expects. Where geography allowed it, saloon owners and dedicated icemen cut ice off frozen rivers and ponds in the dead of winter, in blocks sometimes 2 feet thick, and packed it into windowless ice houses insulated with sawdust or straw a foot deep on every side. Done properly, a well-built ice house could keep ice solid clear through August. That ice wasn't going into drinks for the average cowboy, not usually. It went to the saloon owner's own beer, which genuinely needed cool storage to stay drinkable, and to the handful of wealthy patrons willing to pay a premium for a cold one. In towns near a rail line, commercial ice started arriving by the 1870s and 1880s, shipped in insulated rail cars from ice houses in cities like Chicago. And a saloon within reach of a depot could buy a delivery the way a modern bar buys kegs. But reach the far edge of cattle country, the towns 6 or 8 days from the nearest rail spur, and that ice supply chain simply didn't extend that far. Beans Langtree, sitting in the Texas desert with the nearest railroad access at the mercy of weather and washouts, is closer to the norm for the deep frontier than the exception. Even where ice was available, it was rationed like currency. A saloon owner might buy a block on Monday and stretch it, wrapped in sawdust and blankets in the coolest corner of the cellar, to last most of the week, using slivers of it for the whiskey of a paying customer who asked, and never for the kitchen. Ice wasn't infrastructure yet, not out past the rail line. It was a luxury good that happened to be made of water, and treating it that way, sparingly, deliberately, kept a saloon from ever depending on a resource that could vanish the moment a shipment got delayed or a summer ran hotter than the ice house was built for. So the saloons furthest from that supply chain leaned hardest on the oldest cooling trick there is, the ground itself. Root cellars and dugout storage rooms, sometimes nothing more than a hole under the floorboards lined with boards, held a steady temperature 10 or 15 degrees below the surface air, simply because dirt is an excellent insulator. Butter, eggs and milk, when a saloon had any, went straight underground. Some outfits built a springhouse over a cold-running creek, letting the water itself do the cooling. The same principle a modern wine cellar still runs on. None of it hit today's refrigerator temperatures. All of it bought hours, sometimes days, which, in a business that turned its stock over daily, was frequently all a saloon actually needed. And that's rung 4, the one that mattered more than any single preservation trick: turnover. A saloon didn't need to keep food safe for a week. It needed to keep it safe until tonight's crowd cleared the pot. And cattle towns, during a drive or a roundup, had no shortage of hungry, paying men to make sure that happened. The chili pot that started at dawn was usually gone by midnight, refilled and reheated all day, never given the chance to sit long enough for spoilage to catch up. Restaurants today plan menus around shelf life. A frontier saloon planned around velocity. Sell it fast enough, and the cooling problem mostly solves itself. That velocity had a dark side, and honesty requires saying so. Not every saloon got the arithmetic right. Contemporary accounts from the era describe outbreaks of what people at the time simply called camp sickness, or ptomaine poisoning, tied back to meat held too long in summer heat. And a saloon or chuck wagon cook with a bad reputation for it could lose customers to the place next door fast, in a business with essentially zero regulatory oversight and a clientele that settled complaints with fists as often as words. The threat wasn't abstract. It was the thing every rung on this ladder existed to prevent. There was no board of health riding into a cow town to shut a bad kitchen down. The correction, when it came from the customers, and it came fast. A cook who served bad meat once might not get a second chance to serve it twice, not because a regulator wrote him up, but because 40 armed, exhausted men with money in their pockets simply rode to the saloon down the street the next night. Reputation functioned as the only food safety inspector the frontier had, and it was a brutal, effective one. The bread mattered here too, and it's easy to overlook. Sourdough starters, kept alive and fed for years, sometimes passed between cooks like a family heirloom, gave saloons a way to bake without buying fresh yeast on a supply line that barely existed. A living culture, bubbling in a crock by the stove, was as much a piece of cold chain infrastructure as the ice house out back, just built from flour and thyme instead of frozen water. Which brings the story back to Bean, because his particular version of the saloon as supply chain came with an added twist nobody else on the frontier had. He was also the local judge. The only law for hundreds of miles under the self-appointed title Law West of the Pecos, and multiple period accounts describe him settling disputes, including ones over bad food or an unpaid bar tab, from behind his own bar, gavel in one hand and whiskey bottle within reach of the other. The saloon wasn't separate from the justice system. It was the courthouse, the post office, and the only restaurant in town, all under one roof. And the food had to hold up to feeding whoever the law just finished sentencing, sometimes minutes later. Scale that up across 100 towns like Langtree, and a pattern falls out of it. Refrigeration wasn't a switch Cattletown cooks were missing. It was a problem they solved with an entirely different toolkit. Chemistry instead of compression, timing instead of temperature control. And it worked well enough to feed the entire cattle drive economy for 3 decades without a single electric compressor anywhere in it. The modern cold chain didn't make that toolkit obsolete so much as it made it invisible, because nobody notices a problem once it's been solved for 100 years running. So the next time a walk-in cooler hums somewhere behind a kitchen, it's worth remembering what stood in for it. A barrel of brine, a smokehouse out back, a hole dug under the floor, and a pot of chili simmering hot enough and moving fast enough that spoilage never got the chance to catch up. The question worth sitting with isn't whether the frontier had refrigeration. It's how much of what still feeds people today only works because someone in a dusty saloon 140 years ago had already solved the problem, using nothing colder than dirt and salt. If a story like this is worth your time, there's a deeper one waiting on the ice trade itself, the one that shipped New England ponds to saloons 1,000 miles away. And it's a stranger business than this one.